everybody, and welcome to this episode of Build It Better. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLead. I am one of your co-hosts today, and I am joined by
Ben Lesh. I'm at Ben Lesh on Twitter.
Yes, and today we have David Khourshid. Some people call him David K Piano because that is his Twitter handle of XState and Stately. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, we are so excited to have you and to just dig into fun things. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about just XState and Stately, and then we can dive into the hard questions.
Sure. So I've been a developer for, I lost count, over 12 years now. And before or currently, I was a musician. So I studied piano at the University of Central Florida. And so that's why it shows here David K Piano. That just stuck and I just kept it. But a while ago, I created this library called XState, which makes it easy to visualize application logic written as state machines. Just because I'm really passionate about the entire team understanding what the heck is going on in your application instead of that being stuck in the developer's head. And so about a year and a half ago, I formed a company that is called Stately. And now we do this as a business, just making application logic accessible to entire teams.
So exciting.
Very cool. So the distinction between Stately and XState is that XState's the library and Stately is the company kind of around the ideas that the library represents, right?
Exactly. So Stately is like the tools and services for you creating executable diagrams. Of course, XState's a first-class citizen where you could create state machines and state charts with Stately, but we're looking broader. So allowing people to create all sorts of diagrams, which aren't just pretty pictures. They're actually diagrams that reflect the actual logic in your applications.
All right. But they can be pretty pictures though, right?
Of course. Yeah. Prettiness is definitely a core mission of ours.
That's good. Otherwise I would not be down. Tracy, would you be down if they were not pretty?
They have
no, but I'm down for anything David does, but I'm just generally excited because I feel like this is just really kind of one of the trends you're seeing these days, right? Like the tools and kind of the startups that we're seeing get funded, right? And just kind of like this new way to do development, like just all these things to just help make the developer experience better is really going to change how we do development in the next 5 to 7 years, I would say. And it's going to change how I feel like development teams are managed, the visibility that we get into like what's actually happening. So things aren't as like nebulous in a sense, right? And hopefully making just like your mission, right? Like making things just more accessible for people who, maybe aren't like, the rock stars or the whatever, like to know what on earth is going on.
Right.
Yeah, I need things to be accessible for me, to be honest, to know what's going on. There's all right. So one question I have about this, because it's like when you have diagrams to do all your state management stuff and like that kind of configures your state management, you're almost like writing code with no code, right? So almost, not really. You still have to, there's boxes to fill in there. Like you can't just be like, oh yeah, this is going to do my data fetching and stuff for me too, right? But like I'm wondering, has there been, have you seen any adoption with this towards like the no code, like front end stuff where someone's like, I would like to do as much of this visually as possible. And then maybe I just fill out the data access bits or whatever. Is that a thing that you've seen with your stack at all?
So that's exactly the use case. Whether it's a developer or a project manager who's creating these flows or machines, as we call them, they're basically taking that and delivering it to the development team. Not handoff; it's more of a collaborative thing, but they're delivering it as code. And so basically, they're saying, here's the general higher level human readable view of what the logic of the app should be. Please fill in the details. And so this, I think there's a distinction between no code and code, where no code in my view, is actually more like no control, because a lot of people are scared of no code, in that, yeah, you could drag these boxes around. It's really simple, but as soon as your use case gets complex enough where no code can't really satisfy it, then you have to jump into code, or you have to do some sort of crazy workaround, just to get past that restriction from no code. So that's why this is more like visually augmented code, where you're using these visual diagrams as a way to abstract the different parts of your code, which could be whatever you want, and in the future just whatever language you want. And you're using that as the foundation for just putting all of your application logic in neat boxes.
That's pretty cool. All right. Well, the when you're building this, there's a lot involved with this. Like, I have done things where I had to build like visual layout things, like with the web. Like, it's a huge pain in the butt. Anytime you get outside of the bounds of like, I'm building a form, I'm displaying text, like I'm displaying a table, like on the web, it's automatically a pain in the ass to deal with whatever you're doing. And then of course there's a whole like developing a state machine, building stuff in open source, there's the company side of things. But I'm wondering if during your development time on this, did you ever run into like a weird, gnarly problem? Because the reason I ask is one of the things that I like to talk about with people when we go to conferences and you get to sit around with a bunch of other open source authors is like, they'll bring up some weird thing that happened. And it's not the usual, like, here's my library and here's how it works. It's like most of the people at the table probably know those things. And instead it's like, there's this weird quirk that we had to work around that happens with this edge case that we hit because we have millions of people using this, and here's what it is. Like, is there any like really strange problems that you had to solve during the development of all of this stack of stuff that come to mind when you
I would say one of the most exciting things about working at Stately is about 70% of what we do is weird problems. Like, there are far more weird problems than there are normal problems. It's not like we're creating a SaaS where, okay, you create a backend, you create a front end, and that backend, nowadays it's just a wrapper for OpenAPI, to just send stuff out to ChatGPT, and then boom, there's your data. Please pay us $10 a month for this generated AI. Like, no, we are doing something much, much more complex. And you were talking about forms. Of course, forms on the web are tricky, and I would argue that most applications are basically just glorified multi-step forms, really. You have buttons, you have fields, you have data that you display, and you could click and go to a different screen and all of that. But as soon as you move away from that and you get into the type of app where now you have more visual aspects. So you're going from, I guess, a 1D thing to a 2D thing, or even a 3D thing, where you actually have to manipulate things via drag and drop. You have to visualize things. You have a canvas to work on. The complexity goes way up. And there's definitely no one size fits all. It's not like, oh, you have a React app, we could just bolt something on top of Next.js, or you have a Vue app, we could put something on top of Nuxt. Like, there's nothing like that. There's many libraries that you could work from, but we've run into so many interesting and unique use cases that we've iterated on many different solutions, and so that's just all to say that there's a ton of weird problems that we've run into.
It's like a really good thing to put on your recruiting page. Solve weird problems with us.
Oh yeah, and they are. In fact, I like to joke that. So I worked at Microsoft for 4.5 years, and I remember just pulling so many all-nighters studying algorithms like Leet's code and all of that to interview for the company and eventually get in, just because I didn't have a computer science background, so I had to really upskill on that. And the number of times I've actually used that stuff at Microsoft, 0. But the number of times that we've actually had to use like really algorithmic stuff like graph traversal, optimization problems, like there's so many instances of that when working at Stately. Like we actually have to use the algorithms that developers say like, oh, there's no use case for these.
Right. Yeah. If you get far enough off the reservation, every now and then you'll find yourself writing a binary search or something. Like, wait, I didn't think I actually had to do this ever, but here I am.
Right.
No, that's cool. When it comes to bolting XState or whatever on top of a framework, is there any one framework that's particularly difficult and one that's like easier to deal with when it comes to XState, like given that they're all a little different? Or
Yeah, so all frameworks are a little different. We do have official wrappers for or I don't want to say most of them because there's so many, but a lot of them like React and Vue. And so the way that like XData is consumed, you're basically subscribing to it. And coming from the RxJS world, it's a pretty familiar concept. You're subscribing to something, and you could also send it events. So it's sort of like a bi-directional thing. It's this object where it could send and receive events, and that's pretty much it. It's basically like Redux, but in a more flexible way, I guess you could think of it. And so with a lot of frameworks that integrate with things like Redux, etc., it's actually pretty easy to just bolt on XState. So that's why Vue and React were pretty straightforward. Recently, we've released XState Solid. And so that was a little bit of a challenge just because Solid expects to, to observe the entire object. It's using proxy magic to do that. And since we had our own like state objects that weren't really built for that, it became a little bit challenging to do that. And I guess another challenge just because of unfamiliarity is Angular. But here's the funny thing. We don't have an official wrapper for Angular. No one on the team knows Angular really that well, but that hasn't stopped people from using XState with Angular. And actually, when one of our team members, Mateusz, tried out Angular and basically just learned it to see like how hard would it be to add XState inside of Angular, it took all of 10 minutes because the thing that you get from interpreting a state machine is observable already. So you could just pass that around, use Chrome with RxJS and subscribe to it, and then send it events, and it's super easy.
Yay, RxJS.
Yeah,
it saves the day. No, yeah. So I was just wondering because like in Rx, like observables just work with Svelte. Like that's a thing. Or they someone said that they just work with Solid, but I haven't tried that, or I haven't even tried Solid. I'm sorry to tell folks out there, but but yeah, but then ironically, I work in React all the time, which is like the least ergonomic way to use RxJS. So that's why I was curious if there was one or like a framework that worked especially well with XState, and one that was like you required a little bit more manual finagling to get it wired up. But it sounds like if you already have wrappers for it, then
yeah. And I mean, even just without wrappers, philosophically, Angular would be the easiest way to work with XState, even though I don't have much Angular experience. It's just because Angular treats like the unit in Angular is the observable. And so an actor that we call, it's basically that. You could subscribe to it, you could send it events, everything is contained inside that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Do you have your own observable implementation under the hood?
Sort of, extremely light. So we're basically, just listening for observers. So you have a complete next error, that object, and then we have it on an observers set. I guess we could do more optimizations like ref counting and things like that to make sure that we, we garbage collect properly and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's a very, very light implementation that's compatible with RxJS.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm always curious about that. Like there's one of the talks I give recently isn't really about Rx. It's just about how everyone's using observables, and a lot of libraries don't even realize they're using it. Like you at least know that you're using one. So cool.
So
Tracy,
what did you feel like you just is there anything you just really pounded your head over, or like weird things you kind of had to debug, or like weird workarounds you've had to do, maybe even talking about like all these different use cases, right? Like I'm just so curious, how does it it's like, especially when you're building a product, right? Like, what are all the weird edge cases that you've been like, okay, and then, you know, are there some interesting ones that you can share how you solve them?
Yeah, so I'll talk about one, which is really a collection of a
Hmm.
lot of them, just because I've wasted months, if not years, of my life just figuring this kind of thing out. And
Uh-huh.
it's the diagramming portion of that, of basically the editor, and in a way, the visualizer too. So when I started prototyping, like, what would a diagramming tool for state machines and state charts where you could actually edit it, like, what would that look like? I started that about like 2 or 3 years ago. You know, I was still working at Microsoft, so this was early mornings, late nights, weekends, all of that stuff, just playing around with it. And I've had so many different prototypes of how this would work. And so when you're building a diagramming tool, there's many different directions you could go. There's Canvas. You could use a straight up Canvas, which is going to be your most performant option, but you really lose out on benefits of accessibility and styling. Like, those are the two big things that you really don't get out of the box with Canvas. You can't style Canvas elements with CSS. You can't add accessibility attributes to any of the elements unless you do a lot of extra work. And even then, there's no way you're going to be 100% compatible with if you were to just use SVG or HTML. There's also SVG. Now, SVG is really flexible, but of course, it's a learning curve. And even back then, I wasn't an SVG expert. So you're really learning things, you know, one at a time. And that there's a lot of difficulty with that too, in terms of making your own way of doing zooming and panning, and also performance is always a concern as well. So for the longest time, I actually chose SVG because, again, I wanted the ability to style, I wanted the ability to have accessibility attributes, and also there's this cool little elements that I later realized would cause us a lot of trouble, called foreign object. So foreign object worked pretty well because we also wanted the states and the events and just every element inside of the diagram to be interactive, because after all, this is an executable diagram. We didn't just want it to be a plain SVG thing. We wanted people to add buttons, add descriptions, change text formatting, all without us having to, you know, calculate every little thing and do extra work for that. So we were just like, okay, let's stick it in foreign object. So we used that, and we used resize observer, which we're so glad it exists, because when you have things in HTML elements, SVG doesn't know the size of them. HTML, it automatically calculates the size. So you can't just put a text or whatever in SVG and expect it to do the wrapping correctly and expect the rectangle to size appropriately to it. SVG doesn't have that concept. So that's why we opted for using foreign object and putting HTML inside of there and adding a resize observer in order to make sure that we have the sizes correctly, so we could tell SVG, this is the size of the foreign object. Can you please draw a rectangle around that? So we did that for a while, and it actually worked pretty well until there were more and more people asking for Safari support. And since I primarily develop in Chrome and sometimes Firefox, I rarely open Safari. So when I opened it, I just realized it does not work at all. And so I was like, okay, foreign object is is acting a little bit weird. Things are not sized correctly. Things are like straight up hidden. So I searched Stack Overflow, because there's always an answer on Stack Overflow, you know, for these kinds of things, especially Safari support. And the consensus and basically every answer was, hey, this is a 12-year-old bug or something like that, and there is no solution. Like it just straight up said, you're not going to be able to fix this problem. So we had to go back to the drawing board. And at the same time, my friend, and you probably know him, Steve Ruiz, sorry. He created this library called TL-Draw, which is really, really awesome. It's it's basically like Excalidraw, but you know, with a few more features, nicer UI, etc. I really enjoy using TL-Draw, and it's basically the same thing. It's almost the same thing. It's a diagramming tool for making these types of diagrams where you could embed things onto it. So you could like copy paste Google Maps or even entire web pages onto it, like just different kinds of embeds. And so of course you needed that mixing of HTML and SVG too. But I opened his up in Safari and I saw, hey, it actually works, and it works really smoothly. So I realized that he was actually using a different technique where instead of having a giant SVG element and putting little sprinklings of foreign object with HTML inside, he inverted that. So there was an HTML element with everything absolutely positioned as HTML elements inside. And then inside those HTML elements were separate SVG elements. So that inversion actually, it seemed a little bit weird because here's me thinking in the future, I really want to export this as SVG, make that really easy to do. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it made a lot of sense, but it did require a lot more math. And I don't know how long we have, so I'm going to just skip over the math parts. But we ended up doing the same thing where we inverted that. So we basically have an HTML canvas with SVG sprinkled all over it. And it works in Safari, and it's actually the performance improved too. So yeah, that was one of the
That's really
big
cool.
challenges that
Yeah.
spans many years.
I mean, that's kind of amazing to just like see. It's great that, there's just like so much happening in open source, and like we can share from each other and learn best practices and be like, oh my God, I didn't think about that. Oh, this is better.
Right.
Yeah. The whole, I'm not a stranger to having to work with SVG, and that it's one of those. I had the same thing one time too, where it was like, oh look, I've got a foreign object and the thing inside changed sizes, and it's got this viewport thing. Like, what the hell? Like, and it's one of those things where like you explain some of this stuff, like this things like this that happen to like backend developers, and they're just like spaced, like absolutely, like I can't believe that you have to deal with that. And it's like, oh, not only do I have to deal with that, it's there's a 12-year-old bug, and this is actually better than it used to be like
And then
20
they
years
say you
ago.
should get a raise.
Yeah. It's bizarre. Like that, as soon as you, like I said, as soon as you leave the realm of like regular, here's a form and here's display some text and whatever, like even that gets difficult. But like,
yeah,
you get into like the SVG and Canvas, or like even avant-garde DOM rendering, and it can be a nightmare.
Yeah, it's like a whole different world. It's like if you thought that CSS was hard, try doing things in SVG. It's like you're graduating from how do I center this box to how can I zoom in and out of this box and make this box appear next to another box in arbitrary positions. And an even harder problem, how do you connect a line between those two boxes automatically so that the line actually looks nice and doesn't overlap things that it shouldn't be overlapping? That's a really difficult problem on its own too.
Yeah.
It's so sad. It's just like you're talking about connecting a line, like a line in between two boxes,
What would you think would be simple, but it's definitely not.
Yeah, you think there'd just be like, oh yeah, there's already an SVG for that, right? Like you just, like I mean, like you'd think that someone would have solved the problem in a componentized way that you could just be like, yeah, here's the beginning, here's the end, you figured out computer, but nope. Although we're ChatGPT away from like being able to give me
ChatGPT is like the new give me a Kleenex,
right.
Yeah. Do you feel like with just kind of the stuff you're seeing and it sounds like it's just harder than it should be in a sense, right? So like, where are the standards? What's happening? Are there things going on? Are you advocating for any better standards to happen to make your life not so crazy in this world?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, our use case is such a niche use case that I don't think that it would be worth the time. Like, this is one of those things where it's like the number of interested parties in solutions like this are like you could count them on one hand. Right. And even so, there's some advanced software like Y files from YWorks, I believe.
Mhm.
I mean, they're closed source, but they do a really good job at layouts and graph rendering and stuff like that. And
Mhm.
there's also Elk.js, which is open source, but it's compiled from or transpiled from Java. So we use that to do automatic layout and stuff like that
Nice.
too. But if there's an error, which there tends to be, the error is completely unreadable because it comes from Java. So like
Yay.
it's impossible to debug. But yeah, so there are lots of libraries around this. There's Go.js, JS Plum, etc. In fact, in the React land, a popular library and one that I appreciate a lot is React Flow. And
Mhm.
you're seeing more and more applications built off of React Flow. We couldn't use anything like React Flow because our requirements were a lot bigger than what React Flow provides. We needed nesting. We needed certain rules for how different things in the diagram displayed. So all that to say that, there's many different solutions for this kind of thing, whether you're trying to do things in the SVG or the
Mhm.
DOM. And I think that there's no one size fits all, nor should there be a one size fits all. Different
Mhm.
trade-offs for different use cases.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining. We always end this off with a would you rather question. So
Here it
I
comes.
asked, well, here's the thing. I asked ChatGPT to create this because that's Ben's request of me doing it.
Because because she says stuff like, "Would you rather eat a piece of cheese or ride a horse to the moon?" Like it'll be like some weird thing.
Well, this one's weird
Wild.
too. Okay, so So I said, create a complicated and funny would you rather question about XState and state machines.
Ooh, okay.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you rather spend a day stranded on a deserted island with only a state machine built with XState for company, or be stuck in an elevator with a broken state machine that can only transition between working and not working?
Oh gosh. Does the broken state machine control the elevator? I mean, that's a question.
So what would you rather do?
Yeah. So I think
I think the elevator has a broken state machine, is what I
okay.
was implying. Yeah.
Interesting. Honestly, I'd probably choose the deserted island because with a sufficiently advanced and sufficiently large state machine, you basically have AI, and not in the like chat GPT, we're going to parrot out a response that seems really plausible AI, but more like the type of AI that could actually understand and do things and like just reason about like that symbolic AI where it actually knows what it's talking about. So
Can
yeah.
it
This is
make
pretty
you a
good because
sandwich?
it did specify it was built with XState. So we're going to build artificial intelligence with XState. Can you imagine the node dependencies you'd have with that? Like your node modules would be like, whoa.
Like just give us your entire disk space and we're good to go.
What would you rather do, Ben?
I don't know. Let me think about this. I mean, I don't know. The elevator might be fun. Of course, you could end up dying on the elevator. Of course, you could end up dying on the island too. So I think just for sake of difference, I would pick the elevator probably.
Yeah.
It's, especially if it's like working and then it's not, and they're like, oh, you'd have these moments of excitement. Like, I'm going to finally oh no, it stopped again. So.
Well, if you're in the elevator, I'll spend a day with you, Ben. So sorry, David. The only reason I didn't pick the deserted island is because it sounds hot, and
I'm used to it.
I don't like heat. So, okay. Well, thanks everyone for listening. You can follow David on Twitter at David K Piano. Check out stately.ai as well. XState on GitHub. If you're not using it, oh my gosh, you should. Doesn't matter if you're junior, mid-level, senior, architect, program manager, project manager. It's just a great way to like help understand what's going on under the hood. And I think it's always just been a great way for I like recommending XState when I talk about building inclusive development teams, because it kind of takes the pressure off of, an architect or somebody like only knowing what to do or only knowing the path. You know, you can kind of like map out the path for the rest of the team. Without, do you use it, Ben? Do you use that work to make your
No,
life
we haven't hit that use case yet. It does sound like it's always in the back of my head. Like if we've got a situation where I'm like, this is a lot, but a lot of what I do is data visualization. So it's just like you get the data and then you display the data. Like there's usually not a lot involved in there as far as like needing to manage the state of anything. But
yeah. Well, cool.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for listening and tuning in, and we'll see you next time.